You're a wonderful man. In your satin tights. Condor Man. Hey, I'm Pater Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues, where I talk about my favorite DC comics of the past that are still affordably available today, blabbing about why they're special to me and what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, warning, this series does freely contain spoilers, but I think even spoiled, the stories I feature are still well worth reading. For more information about the intent of this series and what to expect from it, check out the video on the Christian Geek Central YouTube channel titled Essential Issues Series Introduction. Alright, well, we've covered some key origin stories from DC Comics. We've been moving now into stories that feature major events in the DC universe, or that in some way define the status quo, or that are, in my view, iconic representations of DC characters. Among game-changing events in the DC universe, near the top of that list for the Batman cast of characters, is what happens in Batman: The Killing Joke by Alan Moore, with art by Brian Bolland and John Higgins, originally published in 1988. This story came about 2 years after Frank Miller redefined Batman with The Dark Knight Returns in 1986, and continued DC's exploration of darker themes and increased psychological realism. Now, a brief warning for those watching the YouTube version of this content: I will be showing images from the original comic, which was intended only for mature readers, and contains disturbing violence and some images of violent, light nudity. When the story takes place, Batman has been active for years and has had a long-time rivalry with the Joker. He recognizes that on their current trajectory, one or both of them is going to kill the other at some point, and he wants to prevent that if he can by at least once going to Arkham and trying to reason with the Joker. But the Joker has escaped again. He shockingly intrudes on an evening between Commissioner James Gordon and his daughter Barbara, who, unbeknownst to her father, was also the superhero Batgirl at this time. Catching Barbara off guard by simply showing up at the front door, the Joker fires a single shot to her midsection when she opens the door to answer. He uses his goons to capture the Commissioner and then prepares to undress Barbara to take pictures of her as we cut away to a different scene. The main story is intercut with flashback sequences that we eventually realize represent the Joker's past. Although traditionally the Joker's true identity is unknown, and this story keeps it that way, we see flashback scenes indicating that he was at one time a struggling stand-up comedian with a loving wife to support and a baby on the way that he would also need to support, and he's feeling the pressure of that. Out of a desire to support his wife and child, the comedian agrees to help a gang break into the chemical plant that he used to work at, while wearing the costume of the Red Hood, a fictional leader the gang created for themselves, played by a different sucker recruited for every job, as a failsafe to deflect blame should anything go wrong. Returning to the present, Batman is visiting Barbara in the hospital after what the Joker had done to her. She is paralyzed from the waist down. While I didn't read this story when it first published, I'm grateful for it, since I really disliked the trend for both Batman and Superman to have copycats of themselves added to the DC universe. Superboy, Supergirl, Superwoman, Superdog, Supercat, Horse, I kid you not, these were all things. And Batman was almost as bad with Batgirl, Batwoman, and even a Batmite, whatever the crap that is. Now, I can only say this comfortably because we are talking about a fictional character, but a move like this, to have this effect on Barbara, was really cleaning house as far as I was concerned, and at the same time added gripping tragedy to Batman's cast. On top of that, it was this injury that paved the way for Barbara to reinvent herself years later as Oracle, the ultimate information source for the superhero community. I loved her as Oracle, and despite Gail Simone writing an awesome book when they removed her paralysis and made her Batgirl again in recent years, I think Oracle is conceptually a much more interesting, unique hero concept. Anyway, getting back to this story, the Joker's crime here is also, as Barbara herself says, taking it to the limit this time. This was the first time I read a Joker story in the comics that actually disturbed me, and it defined for me who the Joker is. He is not merely a prankster with a slightly dark edge. He is horrifyingly disturbed, and easily the most rightly feared villain in Batman's rogues gallery, if not also the rest of the DCU. As the story continues, we find that Joker has taken Gordon to a broken-down amusement park, stripped him naked, and bound him with S&M-style dog collar and rod to be led around by facially deformed little people wearing costumes of some random, possibly perverse nature. The Joker is attempting to drive Gordon mad by putting him through the most shockingly tragic experience possible. His reasons for doing this begin to unfold with another flashback into the Joker's past, in which we learn that the pre-Joker comedian, just hours before the robbery he is set to participate in, is informed that his wife and unborn child have died as the result of an electrical accident. He is shocked and distraught, but is forced by threat of death from the gang members to make good on his role in the heist anyway. When the job goes bad, the comedian tries to escape, chased by Batman, who is unable to stop him from fleeing by jumping into a vat of chemicals that empties into a nearby reservoir. On the shore again, the comedian can tell something is wrong. He feels his skin burning, and he pulls off the red hood to discover the both hideous and ridiculous transformation he has undergone. It is seemingly the final ironic and fitting straw that just breaks him, and he instantly and irrevocably is lost in the madness of his new persona, the Joker. Now, I have to admit that this origin story is not as interesting to me today as it was the first time I read it. I do like that the Joker is given a past we can potentially sympathize with, but the comedian strikes me as such a pathetic figure that I struggle to imagine how he could be such a brilliant nemesis for Batman later on. Now, maybe he had those brilliant qualities from previous jobs and education in his life. I don't know. We only see this little snapshot here in this brief story of what was going on in his life. And so I can accept that maybe those other elements that came into play from his personality that made him so brilliant and dangerous, maybe those were in other panels, in other stories that haven't been told yet about the Joker's past. But even allowing for that, this certainly, as a result, doesn't work for me as the definitive origin story for the Joker that I once took it as. Nor am I sure there is a definitive origin story for the Joker, or should be one. In some ways, the route taken by the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, in which several origins are suggested for the Joker but none are committed to, is preferable to me these days. And from what I hear, DC has just mucked the Joker up even more in the DC universe by making him, I don't know, 3 different people or some kind of immortal force of evil or I don't know what. I think he works best as a human who is just really, really broken. You know, they lost me shortly after having him cut his own face off and wear it as a mask. This is a character that just falls apart for me if you make his visual design or his backstory overly busy. So, while I don't like the Joker to be too complicated conceptually, I do still appreciate the reminder of his humanity that we're given in this book. And for those of us who feel like this Joker origin, ultimately falls short, Alan Moore thankfully built in a very subtle out. When telling Batman that he assumes Batman became Batman because of a bad day that he had at some point, the Joker reflects on his own past, saying, something like that happened to me, I'm not exactly sure what it was. Sometimes I remember it one way, sometimes another. If I'm going to have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice. In other scenes, the Joker talks about how he prefers not to think of the past. So maybe his uncertainty of his past in these panels here is just him blocking it out, and the flashbacks we see in this story are his real history. But It could also easily be the case that the flashbacks we're shown in this story are merely one way that the Joker remembers his past from time to time, and could be a complete invention based only on the core reality of there being some tragic event or events in his life he now cannot remember. This is my preferred interpretation of this story in the Joker's past. After what he puts Jim Gordon through, his own tragic flashbacks can almost seem more tame by comparison. So I prefer to think that if something tragic made the Joker what he is, it was a whole lot of tragic, all at once, in far more disturbing ways than any writer will dare put on paper. I think it works best as ultimately something that is unknown, but I do appreciate them saying that it was at least some form of tragedy, some form of horrible experience that triggered it. That's enough for me. That's enough. So what did he do to Jim Gordon that makes me say that, the backstory for the Joker presented here is potentially more tame by comparison, depending on how you look at it? Well, getting back to the story, James Gordon, who already saw his daughter shot in front of him, is now abducted, stripped naked, and forced to ride through a carnival ghost house that has been modified to display large pictures of his daughter, Barbara, bleeding in agony, naked on the floor in various positions, moments after being shot and paralyzed. Gordon is forced to stay on this ride for presumably hours on end as we cut back and forth between him bumping through doors of the ghost house and Batman scouring the city in search of him. So he must have been on a loop in this thing for hours on end. I'm not sure this story would be published today. Not for objections from the conservative crowd. I mean, there certainly would be objections from the conservative crowd, but I don't think that's what would keep it from being published. I think rather, as we've seen, the political climate has shifted, and objections from the left would likely prevent it from seeing the light of day. Between its arguable exploitation of little people and its victimization of a strong female character, a number of readers would be upset. And I wouldn't necessarily argue with them on some counts. But I do appreciate when stories feature villains who are truly evil and arouse in us a desire for justice, for objective right and wrong to be recognized, and for evil to be defeated once and for all. Comic book stories, I think, are at their best in terms of how useful they can be to us in life, when they aren't merely power fantasies, but they're stories that point to our need for a rescuer in the midst of this horribly broken world we live in. Now, despite his horrible experience at the hands of the Joker, Gordon tells a rescuing Batman to bring Joker in by the book, because he says we have to show him that our way works. Joker has been trying to make the point that everyone is just one really bad day away from becoming like him. And Gordon wants to show the falsehood of this idea by keeping his sanity and his principles when given every reason not to. What's interesting to me is that Gordon appeals to pragmatism here. In other words, he is telling Batman not to lose control and get revenge because doing things by the book, quote, works. He does not say to do things by the book because taking revenge would be morally wrong. I don't find pragmatism very convincing here as a motivation. Who cares if their justice system works in the wake of what has happened to these two people? If Batman can dish out justice sooner, then it makes sense that he should, and not go by the book, to get it done, make it happen sooner. What Gordon should say to be more convincing to me is, we have to show him that our way is better. But this is a statement appealing to objective moral standards that I don't know if Alan Moore, the writer, even believes exist or not. The way he uses the Joker as a mouthpiece for nihilism in this story makes me think that at least when he wrote this, at the very least he was doubting the existence of objective moral values. I don't know. That's my impression. On the other hand, though, the Bible certainly teaches the objective nature of morality, grounded in the nature of God himself. And Scripture would instruct Gordon and Batman here to submit to governmental authorities, in other words, to do things, yes, by the book, but also to ultimately trust that God will deal out any and all punishment due in the end. That doing things by the book now is not because that's going to result in true justice. But that is the way that God wants us to do things for now, provided that obeying the government does not violate other commands from God to us. And that ultimately to trust God to deal out all the punishment that is due perfectly and fully. Paul says in Romans 12:19 in the ESV, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." And as a perfect, all-wise being, he's the only one that's really qualified to deal out justice without falling short of what should be done, and without overkill as well. The story ends with a possibly jaded recognition that people trying to rehabilitate each other is like the blind leading the blind. I'm not sure if that was the intended theme, but it seems like it was to me. Batman offers to help the Joker deal with his past trauma, and the Joker declines, sharing a joke about two mental patients trying to help each other, but clearly incapable of doing so because of their shared insanity. It's a moment that ends the book with a sense of futility that may or may not reflect the author's worldview. And if Batman and the Joker represent humanity in this story, I'd agree that trying to rescue and rehabilitate each other is ultimately futile. Ultimately is the key word. Obviously, we can help each other and bring each other to a better place if we are anchoring ourselves in the right things, the right perspective. But ultimately, we can't take each other where we need to go to really have full rehabilitation from our broken conditions. What Batman and the Joker need, just like humanity needs, is someone who is more capable and knowledgeable than they are, who is compassionate enough to offer them rescue from the state they find themselves in. No such person shows up, and so both characters end the book laughing together at the absurdity of their situation. But as believers, we know that cynical or jaded laughter is the wrong reaction, because we know that someone will bring rescue and make the wrong things right. Jesus has set a day to work all that out. From a story standpoint, Batman laughing at all here is weird to me, given what has just happened to two people he deeply cares about. I can't imagine him being so callous. If, on the other hand, this is Batman going insane, we don't see a follow-up to it in the comics that I'm aware of. I mean, there's been hints of his, potential insanity at different times in the book. Sometimes that's been a concern of his own, but it would actual insanity, taking place is the only way that I could make sense of this laughter that Batman has here at the end of this story. But I'm not sure if Alan Moore is actually committing to that either. Instead, it feels like a moment where the author wanted to make a statement of some kind that was more important to him ultimately than having characters and story that make consistent sense. I'm not going to jump on Alan Moore for doing that. I've probably erred in that direction myself. Anyway, this is well worth reading, I think. You can get Batman, The Killing Joke, used for about $7 to $10, including shipping on Amazon.com, or $6 on Comixology. Next time, what do we got here? Get it ready to show you. We'll be continuing our Batman binge with a story that came hot on the heels of Batman, The Killing Joke and continued propelling the Joker forward as Batman's most threatening villain. This time, the unthinkable happened, and Robin was left dead in the aftermath. Dead-ish. I mean, it's for about 20 years of publishing history until they brought him back, because, hey, this is comic books, right? Okay, so yes, we are going to go back and take a look at Batman, A Death in the Family. I've created some new tiers for our Patreon. On top of many of our original perks, I've added Discord live events, spoiler chat videos, and more. You can get all the info at patreon.com/SpiritBladeProductions.